The small town of Tifton, Georgia, nestled amid sprawling fields and dense woods, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Yet, as the events of that fateful December unfolded, it became clear that some secrets had been buried so deep that even the closest of neighbors could not have imagined the darkness lurking beneath the surface. At the heart of Tifton's community stood Willie Tanner, a man respected and cherished by everyone who knew him. At 49, Willie was the owner of Tanner's Hardware, a family-owned store that had been a staple in the town for decades. People often described him as warm-hearted, the kind of man who could solve any problem with a little advice, a well-worn tool, or a friendly smile. Many of Tifton's older residents remembered how Willie, even as a young man, had a knack for making people feel seen and valued. He was a devoted husband to his high school sweetheart, Lynn, a woman as kind-hearted and community-minded as he was. Together, they were pillars of their church, and it was said that Willie's faith was as steadfast as his love for Lynn. But Willie's life was not as simple as it appeared. Beneath the facade of happiness and stability lay a secret he had concealed with meticulous care, a secret that had begun to gnaw away at him, haunting him in moments of solitude. Willie had become entangled in an affair, one that was not only dangerous but forbidden in the eyes of his friends, family, and faith. Madison Kelly was the daughter of a local family, known for her intelligence, charm, and beauty. At 18, she had a magnetic presence that made her the subject of admiration among her peers and the older generation alike. She was often seen browsing the aisles of Tanner's Hardware, where she would stop to chat with Willie, asking questions about the simplest things just to prolong their conversation. At first, their exchanges were harmless, a casual friendliness that could be easily dismissed as small-town neighborliness. But as the months passed, those brief conversations turned into longer, more intimate discussions. Willie found himself captivated by Madison's wit and youthful energy, a spark he hadn't felt in years. Madison, for her part, was drawn to Willie's maturity, his kindness, and the safety she felt in his presence. Her home life was far from idyllic. Her mother, Tammy, was known to be controlling and fiercely protective, leaving Madison little room to express herself or pursue friendships. Willie became an escape, a forbidden sanctuary where she felt free and appreciated. What began as admiration soon blossomed into something more dangerous, a relationship that would defy social boundaries and set in motion a chain of events that would forever change their lives. Despite his guilt, Willie couldn't tear himself away from Madison. He knew the consequences of his actions, the betrayal to his wife, and the potential ruin of his reputation, but the pull of his emotions was stronger than his sense of duty. He found himself thinking about her constantly, and each time he saw her, the world around him seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. He tried to tell himself it was harmless, that he could end it any time he chose, but deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. His heart and mind were caught in a relentless struggle, torn between the life he had built with Lynn and the tempestuous desire he felt for Madison. As Christmas approached, the weight of his secret grew heavier, pressing down on him like a burden he could no longer carry. He had begun to withdraw from his usual circles, spending less time at church, avoiding gatherings, and pulling away from Lynn, who noticed his absence but chalked it up to the holiday rush at the hardware store. Tifton was bustling with festive energy, families decorating their homes, and the air filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Willie, however, felt none of the usual cheer. Instead, he was consumed by a gnawing sense of dread, a feeling that his life was teetering on the edge of something dark and irreversible. On the morning of December 22nd, Willie left his home early, telling Lynn he needed to pick up supplies for the store. She believed him, trusting his every word as she had for over 3 decades. She kissed him goodbye, her eyes filled with love and unshakable faith, unaware that it might be the last time she would see him alive. While Lynn attended the morning service at First Baptist Church, Willie drove to a secluded area on the outskirts of town, a quiet spot where he and Madison could meet undisturbed. As he parked, His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He knew he had to end things, to put a stop to the affair before it destroyed everything he held dear. But as Madison approached his car, her smile bright and her eyes filled with excitement, his resolve faltered. They sat together in the car, the quiet hum of the engine and the chirping of birds the only sounds around them. Madison spoke excitedly about her plans, her dreams, her desire to leave Tifton and see the world. She saw in Willie a mentor, a guide, and someone who understood her in a way her peers could not. But as she continued to speak, Willie felt a pang of guilt sharp enough to take his breath away. This was wrong, all of it, and he had to put an end to it. "Madison," he interrupted, his voice heavy, "we can't keep doing this. It's not right. I'm married, and you're just starting your life. This, whatever we have, it can't go on." Madison's smile faded, her expression shifting from confusion to hurt. She had grown to care deeply for Willie, to the point where the lines between admiration and love had blurred. She stared at him, her face a mix of betrayal and disbelief. "But I thought you cared about me," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought we had something special." Willie looked away, unable to face the pain in her eyes. "I do care about you, Madison. But it isn't fair to you, to Lynn, or to myself. We're hurting too many people by doing this." The silence between them was thick with tension, each second stretching into eternity. Madison's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed his words. In that moment, something inside her shifted, a sense of abandonment, of betrayal, of anger simmering just beneath the surface. She felt used, cast aside, and humiliated by the very man who had once made her feel special. "I understand," she said quietly, her tone cold and distant. "If that's what you want, then fine. But don't expect me to forget this, Willie." With that, she stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind her. Willie watched as she walked away, his heart heavy with regret and a sense of foreboding that he couldn't quite shake. As he drove back to Tifton, he tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that ending the affair was the only way to restore balance to his life. But deep down, he knew that he had stirred a tempest in Madison's heart, one that would not settle easily. That evening, Willie returned home to find Lynn waiting for him, her face lit with warmth and affection. She had spent the day preparing for Christmas, decorating their home and wrapping presents, her excitement palpable as she spoke about the holiday plans. Willie forced a smile, feeling the weight of his deception more acutely than ever. He hugged her tightly, the familiar scent of her perfume filling his senses, grounding him. He promised himself that he would dedicate himself fully to his marriage, that he would bury the memories of Madison and move forward with Lynn. But as the hours passed, a gnawing sense of unease crept into his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Madison's face, the anger in her eyes, the coldness in her voice. He had broken her heart, and he feared that in doing so, he had unleashed something far darker than he could have anticipated. In the days that followed, Willie's anxiety grew. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his nerves frayed and his mind haunted by what he had left behind. The townsfolk noticed the change in him, his usual cheer replaced by a distracted, almost haunted look. And on the morning of December 24th, as Tifton's residents prepared for Christmas Eve, Willie's life would take a tragic turn, one that would unravel secrets and bring his world crashing down in ways he could never have foreseen. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with a chill that seemed to settle over Tifton, an unseasonably cold spell that wrapped itself around the town like a shroud. For most residents, the holiday spirit was in full swing, with homes adorned in twinkling lights and streets echoing with cheerful greetings. But for Willie Tanner, the festive season had become a prison, each light and decoration a reminder of the perfect life he jeopardized. His thoughts circled like vultures, tearing at him with guilt and regret, but also a dark, inexplicable fear. After his last meeting with Madison, Willie had tried to shake off the unease gnawing at him. He told himself that the worst was over, that Madison would understand and eventually move on. Yet the image of her face, hurt, betrayed, and brimming with an anger he hadn't anticipated, kept intruding on his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing there, looking at him as if he'd stolen something precious from her. He told himself it was simply the guilt playing tricks on him, that the past would soon fade into obscurity, but a deep part of him knew it was a lie. At home, Willie's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Lynn, his wife of over 30 years, watched him with a worried frown, her own heart heavy with concern. She had seen the signs before, how he'd come home late, how his laughter had grown hollow, and his smile more forced. She had asked him, gently, if something was wrong, if he was under pressure at the store, or if there was anything he needed to share. But each time, Willie would brush her concerns aside, insisting it was just the holiday rush. He reassured her with a kiss on the forehead, a quick hug, or a joke that he hoped would ease her worries. But Lynn could feel something festering between them, a shadow that loomed larger with each passing day. On the night of December 23rd, just as the town was settling in for the evening, Willie decided to stay late at the hardware store, claiming he needed to finalize inventory for the end of the year. Lynn hadn't questioned him. She understood the demands of running a business, and it wasn't uncommon for him to put in extra hours during the holiday season. But Willie wasn't there to check inventory. He was trying to escape, to distance himself from his own thoughts, hoping that the monotonous task of organizing shelves and counting supplies would drown out the turmoil in his mind. As he stood alone in the store, surrounded by rows of tools and hardware, Willie felt a strange sense of isolation, as if the world had narrowed down to the four walls of his store and the quiet tension that hung in the air. He picked up a hammer, examining its weight and shape, the cold metal a grounding reminder of reality. But as he looked around, he felt an oppressive silence settle over him. The usually familiar aisles seemed to close in on him, their shadows dark and forbidding. Just then, the bell above the front door jingled, startling him from his thoughts. He turned quickly, his heart racing, only to see Madison standing in the doorway. She was wrapped in a heavy coat, her face half hidden beneath a scarf, but her eyes were sharp and unwavering, locking onto his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Madison, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She stepped forward, her boots echoing on the tile floor. "I needed to see you, Willie. We need to talk." Willie took a step back, gripping the hammer in his hand tighter. "There's nothing left to talk about, Madison. I told you, this has to end." Her eyes flashed, a mixture of hurt and defiance. "End, just like that. After everything we shared, you think you can just walk away?" Her words struck him, and he could feel the desperation in her voice. He tried to remain calm, to remind himself that he had made the right decision, but something in her gaze unsettled him. "Madison, please, you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. I care about you, but this isn't right." "It never was," he said, forcing the words out, even as he felt the weight of them pressing down on him. She shook her head slowly, her expression hardening. "I trusted you, Willie. I thought you were different. I thought you actually cared." Willie felt a surge of guilt, an ache deep in his chest. "I do care, Madison. But this, it can't continue. We'll only hurt each other more." For a moment, there was silence between them, and Willie dared to hope that she would understand, that she would accept his decision and walk away. But instead, Madison's expression twisted into something he hadn't seen before, a cold, calculated anger. "I love you, Willie," she said, her voice low and steady. "But you've made me feel like a fool, and no one makes a fool out of me." With that, she turned and stormed out of the store, leaving him standing there, his mind reeling. As the door swung shut behind her, Willie felt a surge of relief mixed with a gnawing sense of dread. He wanted to believe that it was over, that she would move on, but the look in her eyes had left an impression he couldn't shake. It was a look of determination, of someone who had been wronged and wouldn't rest until she had taken back control. He closed up the store and drove home, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The roads were deserted, the town wrapped in a silence that seemed almost eerie. He tried to clear his mind, to focus on the upcoming holiday. But Madison's words echoed in his thoughts, each one a reminder of the line he had crossed and the damage he had caused. When he arrived home, Lynn was already asleep, her figure peaceful and serene in the dim light of their bedroom. Willie stood in the doorway, watching her, guilt churning in his gut. She looked so trusting, so unaware of the turmoil that had consumed him. He felt like an intruder in his own life, a man torn between two worlds, both of which seemed on the verge of collapse. The next morning, December 24th, Tifton awoke to a blanket of frost covering the ground, the town glistening in the pale winter sunlight. Lynn was up early, bustling around the kitchen as she prepared for their family gathering that evening. Willie tried to act normal, to push away the lingering memories of his encounter with Madison, but the strain was evident on his face. Lynn noticed his distant expression, the tension in his shoulders, but she said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the joy of the holiday. As the day wore on, Willie found himself glancing at the clock, his nerves fraying with each passing hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Every sound, every movement, seemed to set his nerves on edge. He caught himself checking his phone repeatedly, half expecting a message from Madison, an angry outburst, a plea, anything. But his phone remained silent, the quiet stretching into an unbearable tension. That evening, as they prepared to leave for the church's Christmas Eve service, Willie's phone buzzed. His heart skipped a beat, and he glanced at the screen, dread pooling in his stomach. It was a message from an unknown number, a simple text that sent a chill down his spine. "You think you can just throw me away? Think again, Willie." Willie's hands trembled as he read the message, his mind racing. He tried to tell himself it was just a scare tactic, that Madison was acting out of hurt and frustration. But a part of him knew that he had unleashed something he couldn't control, a dark force that had taken root in Madison's heart. His hand shook as he deleted the message, not wanting Lynn to see. He forced a smile as they left the house, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions, fear, guilt, and a growing sense of impending doom. At church, surrounded by friends and neighbors, Willie felt like a ghost, his thoughts miles away. He could barely focus on the service, his attention slipping as he scanned the faces in the crowd, half expecting to see Madison's angry gaze watching him from the shadows. Every hymn, every prayer, seemed hollow, a reminder of the life he had so carelessly risked. By the time they returned home, Willie was exhausted, the weight of his secret pressing down on him like a physical burden. He went to bed, lying awake long after Lynn had fallen asleep, his mind replaying every moment of his affair, every decision that had led him to this point. As he stared into the darkness, he wondered if he could ever truly escape the consequences of his actions, or if the storm he had unleashed would soon consume him entirely. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, he had no way of knowing that the next day would bring his darkest fears to life, a nightmare from which he would never awaken. Christmas Day dawned quietly over Tifton. The town lay wrapped in a blanket of frost, the streets still and silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation. For most residents, it was a day filled with joy and celebration, families gathering to exchange gifts, share meals, and bask in the warmth of the season. But for Willie Tanner, Christmas had become a day of reckoning, a ticking clock counting down the moments until his carefully constructed life unraveled completely. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Madison's face, her cold, calculating gaze, her words like ice cutting through him. He thought about the text message she had sent, its ominous tone, and wondered what she had meant by it. "Think again, Willie." The words haunted him, ringing in his ears as he lay in bed, his body tense with dread. He wanted to believe it was just a threat, an attempt to rattle him, but a deeper instinct warned him that Madison was capable of more than he had given her credit for. As he got dressed that morning, Willie moved slowly, his mind clouded with fear and regret. He could hear Lynn humming a Christmas carol in the kitchen, her voice soft and soothing, blissfully unaware of the turmoil tearing her husband apart. The scent of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the house, and for a moment, Willie allowed himself to imagine that everything was normal, that his life was as it once had been, simple, loving, and secure. But the illusion shattered the moment he looked at his phone. Another message from an unknown number appeared, the words chilling him to the core. "Merry Christmas, Willie. Hope it's as perfect as you always wanted it to be. But don't worry, tonight, I'll make sure it's unforgettable." He stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no doubt in his mind that the message was from Madison. The thinly veiled threat sent a cold shiver down his spine, and he fought the urge to panic. He couldn't let Lynn see him like this. He had to maintain his composure, at least for a few more hours. Swallowing his fear, Willie forced himself to go through the motions of Christmas morning. He handed Lynn her gifts with a trembling smile, watching as she opened each one with genuine delight. She gifted him a new watch, a sleek and elegant piece she had saved up for over the past few months. The gesture, so pure and thoughtful, filled him with a pang of guilt that nearly brought him to his knees. He didn't deserve her love, her devotion, or the life they had built together. And he knew, in his heart, that by nightfall, it might all be torn apart. After breakfast, Lynn suggested they take a walk to visit some neighbors, a Christmas tradition they had kept for years. Reluctantly, Willie agreed, knowing that staying home would only make his anxiety worse. They strolled through the quiet streets, hand in hand, exchanging greetings with friends and neighbors who passed by. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, embodying the spirit of the season. But behind Willie's forced smiles lay a simmering fear, a constant awareness that he was running out of time. As the afternoon wore on, Willie grew increasingly restless, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his secret, the knowledge that his actions had set in motion something terrible. Lynn sensed his tension, and several times she asked him if he was feeling all right. Each time, he brushed her off, insisting he was just tired. But the worry in her eyes was unmistakable, and Willie could feel the cracks in his facade widening with each passing hour. It was late in the afternoon when his phone buzzed again. He glanced down, and his blood ran cold. "Tonight. Be ready, Willie. I'm not going to be ignored." He clenched his jaw, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to stop this from spiraling any further. He knew he had to confront Madison, to put an end to her threats once and for all. He couldn't let her ruin his life, destroy his marriage, and humiliate him in front of the entire town. But as he considered his options, a dark, unsettling realization crept over him. Madison might not be satisfied with mere words. She had been hurt, humiliated, and abandoned, and her anger had grown into something far more dangerous. That evening, as dusk settled over Tifton, and the Christmas lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, Willie made an excuse to leave the house. He told Lynn that he needed to check on something at the store, that he'd be back in an hour. She watched him go with a concerned expression, her brow furrowing, as she sensed the tension he was trying so hard to hide. Willie drove through the quiet streets, his mind a maelstrom of emotions. He felt trapped between the life he had built with Lynn and the shadowy threat that Madison represented. Every corner he turned, every streetlight he passed, felt like a countdown to something he couldn't escape. He parked his car a few blocks away from Madison's house, hoping to avoid drawing attention. The small, unassuming house stood at the edge of town, its lights dim, a single wreath hanging on the door. He approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest as he knocked, half hoping she wouldn't answer. But within moments, the door swung open, and Madison stood before him, her expression a mix of anger and satisfaction. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" Willie took a deep breath, steeling himself. Madison, we need to talk. This has to end. Right now. You can't keep threatening me, sending those messages. It's over. Madison's eyes flashed with fury. Over? You think you can just decide that? After everything we've shared, you think you can just walk away and leave me like this? Madison, please, Willie pleaded, his voice shaking. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. This isn't right. For either of us. Let me go. She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. Let you go. You're the one who led me on, who made me feel like I was special, like I mattered. And now you think you can just toss me aside. Willie took a step back, sensing the depth of her anger, the raw pain she was barely holding back. He could see that reasoning with her was futile, that her emotions had spiraled beyond his control. He turned to leave, desperation clawing at him. But Madison wasn't done. She reached for his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her face contorted with rage and despair. You don't get to walk away from me, Willie. Not after what you did. Not after everything we've been through. Willie pulled his arm free, his voice growing firmer. Madison, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I never should have let things go this far, but you have to let me go. She stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that terrified him. For a moment, there was silence, a tense, electrified stillness that filled the space between them. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, her expression shifted, her face softening, her voice trembling. Willie, she whispered, a hint of vulnerability breaking through. I loved you. I thought you loved me too. He looked at her, his own heart aching with regret, but he knew he couldn't give her the answer she wanted. I'm sorry, Madison. I never meant to hurt you, but this has to end. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of Christmas lights. He felt the weight of her gaze on his back, the unspoken anger and heartbreak radiating from her in waves. As he got into his car and drove away, he felt a strange mixture of relief and dread, knowing he had finally confronted her but fearing the repercussions of their encounter. He wanted to believe it was over, that she would accept his decision and move on. But a part of him knew that Madison was not one to forgive or forget so easily. That night, as he lay in bed beside Lynn, Willie tried to push the memory of Madison's face from his mind. He told himself it was over, that he had done the right thing, and that the nightmare would soon be behind him. But as he drifted into a fitful sleep, a sense of foreboding settled over him, like a storm gathering on the horizon. He had no way of knowing that Madison's final act of vengeance had already been set in motion, and that by morning, the town of Tifton would wake to a tragedy that would shatter its peace forever. The following morning, December 26th, the day after Christmas, dawned cold and gray over Tifton. Clouds hung low in the sky, casting a somber light over the quiet streets. Willie Tanner's household was unusually silent. Lynn had woken early, hoping to enjoy a few moments of peace before the bustle of the day began. She made her way downstairs, thinking she might surprise Willie with a warm breakfast. But as she entered the kitchen, she was struck by the emptiness of the house. Willie's truck was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of him anywhere. She called his name, her voice echoing through the empty rooms, but received no reply. Anxiety began to prick at her, and she tried to reassure herself that he was probably out back, maybe working on something in the garage. But as she checked every corner of their property, a creeping sense of dread started to settle in. By mid-morning, the worry had blossomed into outright panic. She reached for her phone, dialing the number of their close friend and neighbor, Pastor Bill. He answered groggily, having just returned from a late Christmas service, but as soon as he heard the urgency in Lynn's voice, he was alert. I'm coming over right now, Lynn. Stay calm. We'll find him, Pastor Bill assured her. Within minutes he was there, helping her search the property, asking questions, trying to keep her grounded. But as they searched every possible place Willie could be, an unsettling reality began to dawn on them. He had disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, across town, Madison sat in her dimly lit bedroom, replaying her final conversation with Willie in her mind. She hadn't slept the night before. She'd been consumed by a mixture of hurt, anger, and a deep, simmering resentment. The memories of their brief, intense affair clung to her like shadows, filling her with a bitterness she couldn't shake. She felt used, discarded, like a toy he'd grown bored with. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't just let him go. Willie's rejection had stung deeper than she could express. He had been her escape, her fantasy, a figure of admiration and passion in her otherwise monotonous life. But now that he had walked away, Madison felt like her very identity had been shattered. She had built him up in her mind as someone who could save her from the ordinary, who could make her feel truly alive. And now, he had left her with nothing. But Madison was not someone to give up easily. She was clever, determined, and unafraid of taking bold actions. Throughout the night, she had stewed in her anger, plotting her next move with a cold, meticulous clarity. If Willie thought he could simply walk away and forget about her, he was sorely mistaken. By noon, news of Willie's disappearance had begun to spread through Tifton. Friends and neighbors started gathering at the Tanner's home, their faces etched with concern as they offered comfort to Lynn and joined in the search efforts. Detective Nora Collins, a seasoned investigator who had lived in Tifton her entire life, was called in to lead the investigation. Known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach, she arrived with her team, ready to take charge of the situation. Nora quickly began questioning everyone who had seen Willie last. She spoke to Lynn, whose tear-streaked face and trembling hands told her everything she needed to know about the gravity of the situation. Lynn recounted the events of the previous night, mentioning Willie's unexpected decision to go to the store late in the evening. Nora found it strange that Willie would leave so abruptly, especially on Christmas night, and made a note to dig deeper into his recent behavior. As the hours passed, Nora's instincts told her there was more to Willie's disappearance than met the eye. She questioned some of Willie's employees at the hardware store, hoping for clues about his state of mind, but no one could provide any information that seemed relevant. His coworkers only spoke of his recent quiet demeanor, describing how he had seemed distant and distracted in the days leading up to Christmas. It wasn't long before Nora's attention shifted to Madison Kelly. As she pieced together the fragments of Willie's life, whispers began to surface about a young woman who had often been seen in his company, her visits to the hardware store growing more frequent in recent months. At first, Nora dismissed it as small-town gossip, but the more she heard, the more her instincts told her that Madison might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Willie. Madison was home alone when Nora arrived. Her mother, Tammy, was at work, leaving Madison in the house she had come to associate with loneliness and confinement. She was surprised to see Detective Collins at her door, but quickly masked her shock with a calm demeanor, inviting Nora in with a polite smile that barely hid the tension simmering beneath her facade. Nora observed Madison carefully, noting the faint traces of sleeplessness under her eyes, the slightly unkempt appearance that contrasted sharply with her usual polished look. Madison had always been known for her poise and elegance, but today there was something off, a subtle hint of strain that Nora, with her years of experience, recognized immediately. "Madison, I understand you knew Willie Tanner quite well," Nora began, her tone neutral but probing. Madison's expression remained guarded. "Yes, I knew him. He was always very kind to me, like a mentor. I went to his store sometimes. He gave me advice about things." "Things," Nora repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Care to elaborate?" Madison hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. She realized, too late, that her vague response had raised more questions than it answered. She composed herself quickly, forcing a calm tone. "Willie was a good man. He helped me with some personal issues. That's all." Nora could tell Madison was holding back. There was an edge to her voice, a tension in her posture that hinted at something deeper, something she wasn't ready to reveal. Nora decided to press further, her voice soft but unrelenting. "Madison, I'm going to be honest with you. Willie Tanner is missing, and right now, I'm trying to find out what happened to him. I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you see him last night?" Madison's face paled, but she managed to keep her composure. No, I didn't see him," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But Nora's sharp gaze remained fixed on her, catching the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted to the floor. The detective had seen this behavior countless times, signs of a person hiding something, suppressing emotions that threatened to betray them. "Madison," she said gently, "if there's anything you know, anything that might help us, now is the time to speak up. Whatever you're holding back, it's only going to make things harder in the long run." For a brief moment, Madison's expression softened, as if she were on the verge of confessing something. But then her gaze hardened. She squared her shoulders, crossing her arms defiantly. "There's nothing I can tell you, detective," she said firmly. "I don't know where Willie is." Nora regarded her silently, weighing her words. Madison's defiance intrigued her. It wasn't the reaction of someone who was merely concerned for a missing person. It was the reaction of someone who had been wounded, someone holding on to a secret they were unwilling to share. After a long pause, Nora nodded, her voice calm but firm. "All right, Madison. But understand this. If I find out you're withholding information, it won't end well for you. We're going to get to the bottom of this, with or without your cooperation." With that, Nora left, her mind buzzing with questions. She knew Madison was hiding something, but without concrete evidence, her hands were tied. Still, her instincts told her she was close, that Madison was the missing piece in a puzzle that was beginning to reveal a far darker picture than she had anticipated. As night fell over Tifton, the town's residents huddled in their homes, the air thick with tension and speculation. Rumors swirled, theories formed, and a sense of unease settled over the community like a shadow. Willie Tanner, the beloved hardware store owner, had vanished without a trace, and the people of Tifton couldn't help but wonder what secrets lay beneath the surface of their quiet town. Back at her office, Detective Collins pored over the notes from her interviews, her mind racing with possibilities. She could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her, the urgency to uncover the truth before it slipped through her fingers. Somewhere in the web of lies and half-truths lay the answer, and she was determined to find it. And as the clock struck midnight, somewhere in Tifton, a figure moved through the darkness, carrying with them the secret that would shatter the town's peace and forever change the lives of everyone involved. The storm that had been brewing was about to break, and when it did, Tifton would never be the same again. The morning of December 27th brought a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Tifton. The once festive town now wore an uneasy stillness, the news of Willie Tanner's disappearance spreading like wildfire. Everywhere, residents whispered in hushed voices, speculating about what might have happened to the man they had all trusted, the man who had seemed to be the bedrock of their community. And yet, just beneath the surface, there were rumblings of darker suspicions, fragments of gossip that hinted at secrets long hidden. Detective Nora Collins was in her office at the Tifton Police Department, surrounded by a mountain of notes and witness statements. She had spent the previous night replaying every conversation, every suspicious glance, and every evasive answer she'd encountered since Willie had gone missing. Her gut told her she was close to something, a truth that was buried beneath layers of deception and emotion. But the pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, elusive, refusing to coalesce into a clear picture. Nora's thoughts kept circling back to Madison Kelly. There was something about the young woman's demeanor that had unsettled her, a combination of defiance and vulnerability that hinted at a deeper involvement. Madison's refusal to cooperate, her guarded answers, and the tension in her posture had all been telling signs to Nora, signals that there was more to her relationship with Willie than a simple mentorship. She glanced down at the file in front of her, flipping through the pages filled with background information on Madison. Her home life was complicated, to say the least. An overbearing mother, a father who had left under strained circumstances, and a history of behavioral issues that had raised eyebrows in the community. Madison's life appeared to be a cauldron of repressed emotions, simmering anger, and a desperate need for control. Qualities that, when mixed with heartache, could create a dangerous concoction. Nora decided it was time to dig deeper. She made her way over to Madison's high school, where she met with Principal Danvers, a stern but fair man who had watched over Madison's turbulent journey through her senior year. He led Nora to a quiet corner of his office, his expression troubled as he shared his concerns. "Madison is a complicated young woman," he began, choosing his words carefully. "She's intelligent, no doubt about it. Driven, ambitious. But there's also a lot of anger there, Detective. And lately, she's seemed more on edge than usual. I thought it was just the stress of senior year, but now, I wonder if there was something else." Nora nodded, taking in his words. "Did you ever notice anything unusual about her behavior around Willie Tanner? I understand she visited his hardware store frequently." Principal Danvers hesitated, glancing away for a moment before answering. "Yes, I heard some rumors. Nothing concrete, just whispers among the students. Some of them said she'd been spending a lot of time with him. I didn't want to believe it. He was a respected man, and she was so young. But Madison is, well, let's just say she's not easily deterred once she sets her sights on something." The principal's words echoed in Nora's mind as she left the school. Madison was beginning to look less like a vulnerable young girl and more like a storm waiting to break. And as much as she wanted to give Madison the benefit of the doubt, Nora knew better than to ignore the warning signs. Back at the police station, Nora was reviewing security footage from around Tifton, hoping to trace Willie's last movements. After hours of searching, she found a recording from a traffic camera near Madison's house on the night of December 25th. Her breath caught as she recognized Willie's truck driving slowly down the road, coming to a stop in front of Madison's house. He had been there, just as she had suspected. A feeling of triumph mixed with dread settled over her. This was proof that Willie and Madison had met that night, despite Madison's insistence otherwise. She knew she had to confront Madison again, to confront her with this evidence and break through whatever defenses she had built. That afternoon, Nora drove back to Madison's house. Tammy Kelly, Madison's mother, answered the door with a guarded expression, her eyes narrowing as she saw the detective standing on her porch. "Detective Collins," she said stiffly. "What brings you here again?" "I need to speak with Madison." "It's urgent," Nora replied, her tone firm but polite. Tammy's face tightened, her gaze flickering with suspicion. "She's been through enough. She's told you everything she knows." Nora met her gaze evenly. "I'm afraid that's not entirely true, Mrs. Kelly. I have reason to believe Madison may know more about Willie Tanner's disappearance than she's letting on." Tammy's face drained of color, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What are you insinuating?" Nora didn't back down. "I'm not insinuating anything, Mrs. Kelly. I'm simply asking for the truth. Madison is involved in this, one way or another, and if she's withholding information, it's only going to make things harder for her." Tammy stared at her for a long moment, her face taut with barely concealed fury. But finally, she stepped aside, her voice cold. "She's in her room. Do what you must." Nora made her way to Madison's room, her footsteps echoing down the narrow hallway. She knocked once, waiting for a reply. When none came, she opened the door, finding Madison seated on her bed, her gaze distant as she stared out the window. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with shadows, and Nora could see the weight of sleepless nights etched into her expression. "Madison," Nora began, her voice gentle but firm. "We need to talk." Madison didn't look at her. "There's nothing more to say, Detective." "I think there is," Nora replied, stepping further into the room. She held up a still image from the traffic footage, showing Willie's truck parked outside Madison's house on the night he disappeared. You told me you hadn't seen Willie, but this proves otherwise. You lied to me, Madison. Why? Madison's face hardened, her jaw clenching as she stared at the photograph. I didn't lie. I didn't think it mattered. Of course it matters, Nora pressed. You were the last person to see him. I need to know what happened that night. Madison looked away, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. He came to see me. He said it was over, that he couldn't keep doing this, that he was going back to his wife. Nora watched her carefully. How did that make you feel? Madison's eyes flickered, a flash of anger breaking through her calm facade. How do you think it made me feel? He used me. He made me believe in something that was never real. He threw me away, like I was nothing. Her voice cracked, and for a brief moment, Nora saw the vulnerability, the hurt beneath the anger. But it was a fleeting glimpse, quickly replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. What happened next? Nora asked, her voice gentle. Madison's hands clenched, her knuckles white. I told him he couldn't do that to me. I told him I wouldn't let him just walk away. Did you threaten him? Nora's tone was careful, non-judgmental, but the question hung heavy in the air. Madison hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. I might have said some things. I was angry. I didn't mean them. Nora took a deep breath, sensing the gravity of the moment. Madison, this is serious. If there's anything else, anything at all, you need to tell me now. For a long moment, Madison said nothing, her eyes distant, her expression unreadable. But then, as if a dam had finally broken, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. There was a struggle. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. He tried to leave, and I tried to stop him. I grabbed something. I don't even remember what. And then there was blood. Her words trailed off, her face pale as the memories washed over her. Nora felt a chill settle over the room. The truth finally laid bare in all its grim reality. Where is he, Madison? Nora asked quietly, her heart heavy with the weight of the question. Madison swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Out in the woods, near the old hunting cabin. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. Nora felt a surge of both relief and sadness. She had found her answer, but it was a truth steeped in tragedy, a senseless end to a story that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. She stood, her gaze softening as she looked at Madison. I'm going to need you to come with me, Madison. Madison nodded, her face blank, as if the reality of her actions had yet to fully sink in. As Nora led her out of the house, Tammy Kelly stood in the hallway, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Nora met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared sorrow for the lives that had been shattered. The drive to the woods was silent, the weight of the truth settling over them like a shroud. When they reached the cabin, the forensics team began their work, uncovering the final, tragic piece of the puzzle. And as Madison was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and haunted, Tifton's quiet streets echoed with the whispers of a community forever changed, a town that would never forget the tragedy that had unfolded in the shadows of its peaceful existence. The winter sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Tifton as the news of Madison Kelly's confession spread like wildfire. The townspeople, who had once spoken of Willie Tanner with warmth and admiration, now whispered his name in hushed, somber tones. The details of his tragic end and the young woman's role in it became the subject of every conversation, each version of the story more layered with shock and disbelief than the last. Detective Nora Collins felt the weight of it all as she sat in her office, reviewing the final reports. The forensics team had confirmed Madison's account, the evidence pointing to a confrontation that had spiraled fatally out of control. The scene at the cabin had been harrowing. Blood-stained remnants, signs of a desperate struggle, and an unmistakable air of sorrow. Willie Tanner, a man loved and respected by the town, had lost his life in the grip of a tragic obsession that had consumed both him and Madison. Nora took a deep breath, feeling the toll of the case settle over her. In her years of work, she had encountered many stories of broken lives, of anger and betrayal leading to irreversible consequences. But this case had struck a chord with her that she couldn't quite shake. It was a reminder of the fragility of human relationships, of how love, twisted by secrecy and guilt, could lead to darkness. The day after Madison's arrest, Nora received a call from Lynn Tanner. The widow's voice was quiet, almost numb, as she asked to meet with her. Nora agreed, feeling a sense of duty to help Lynn find some closure, even if the answers would only deepen the ache in her heart. They met at the small cafe on the corner of Main Street, a place Lynn and Willie had frequented during their Sunday outings. As Lynn sat down across from Nora, her eyes were distant, her face pale but composed. Nora could see the weariness in her expression, the lines etched into her face from sleepless nights and a grief she could barely express. "Thank you for meeting with me, Detective," Lynn said softly, her voice steady but strained. "Of course, Lynn," Nora replied, offering her a comforting smile. "I know this has been incredibly hard for you. I'm here to help in any way I can." Lynn nodded, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup, as if it were the only thing grounding her. I just don't understand, Nora. I thought I knew him. I thought we had a good life. How could he do this? How could he betray everything we built?" Nora sighed, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people make choices that don't make sense, even to themselves. Willie was a good man, but he got caught up in something he couldn't control. It doesn't excuse his actions, but perhaps it explains them. Lynn looked down, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I keep replaying the last few months in my mind, trying to find the moment when everything changed. I thought he was just busy with the store, stressed about the holidays. I never thought he could be hiding something so big." The pain in Lynn's voice cut through Nora, a raw ache that only deepened the tragedy of it all. Willie's choices had left scars that would linger long after his death, not just for Madison, but for Lynn and the entire community. As Lynn struggled to hold herself together, Nora reached out, placing a comforting hand over hers. "You loved him, Lynn," she said gently. "And that's what matters. Whatever mistakes he made, it doesn't take away the years you shared, the life you built together. Those memories are real, and they're yours to keep." Lynn nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know how to move on, Nora. How do I face this town, this life, without him? How do I forgive him for what he did?" Nora was silent for a moment, searching for the right words. Healing takes time. And forgiveness, well, that's a journey. You don't have to forgive him today or tomorrow. But in time, you may find peace, for your own sake. And remember, you're not alone. Tifton is a community that cares. We'll get through this together. As they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them, Lynn took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked out the window, watching the familiar streets of Tifton, with a sadness that was both bitter and resigned. Nora knew that Lynn's path to healing would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was stronger than she realized. Later that afternoon, Nora paid a visit to Madison, who was being held at the county detention center. The young woman sat alone in a small, sterile cell, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow from days without sleep. Gone was the confident, almost defiant girl Nora had encountered just days before. In her place sat a broken figure, weighed down by the reality of her actions. As Nora approached, Madison looked up, her gaze meeting the detective's with a mixture of shame and defiance. There was a brief silence before Madison spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think I'm a monster?" she asked, her tone a mixture of bitterness and vulnerability. Nora considered her response carefully. "I think you're a young woman who made terrible choices that have hurt a lot of people, including yourself. But it doesn't mean you're beyond redemption. Madison looked away, her fingers tracing patterns on the cold metal of the table. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I loved him, or at least I thought I did. I thought he was different. I thought he'd save me from everything. Nora felt a pang of sadness as she listened to Madison's words, recognizing the loneliness and desperation that had driven her down this path. Madison, love can be beautiful, but it can also be blinding. Sometimes we want something so badly that we convince ourselves it's right, even when it's not. Willie, he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, just like you did. But now, it's up to you to decide where you go from here. Madison's expression softened, a flicker of remorse breaking through her hardened facade. I don't know how to make up for what I did. I don't know if I ever can. That's something only time can tell, Nora replied gently. But taking responsibility, owning up to your actions, that's the first step. Madison nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She looked down at her hands, as if searching for answers within herself. For a moment, Nora saw the lost girl beneath the layers of anger and resentment, a young woman who had been swept up in a maelstrom of emotions she couldn't control. As Nora left the detention center, a deep sense of weariness settled over her. The case had reached its conclusion, but the echoes of the tragedy would linger in Tifton for years to come. The town had lost one of its own, and another would spend her life haunted by the consequences of a single, irreversible decision. In the days that followed, Tifton struggled to find its footing again. The townsfolk gathered at the church to mourn Willie, sharing stories of his kindness and remembering the man he had been before the affair and the scandal that followed. It was a solemn service, filled with tears and quiet reflection, a community coming together to mourn and begin the process of healing. Lynn sat in the front pew, her face pale and drawn, surrounded by friends who offered her comfort and support. She listened to the stories, the memories of Willie as a beloved member of their community, a man who had touched many lives in his own quiet way. And as she sat there, a part of her began to let go, to release the anger and betrayal that had bound her heart in grief. It would take time, she knew, but perhaps one day she could remember him without pain. As for Detective Nora Collins, the case left an indelible mark on her as well. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of human relationships, of how even the closest bonds could be tested by desire, secrecy, and the hunger for connection. She returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to help prevent other tragedies, to be a steady presence for those who found themselves lost in the darkness. Months passed, and the story of Willie Tanner became a part of Tifton's history, a cautionary tale shared in whispers, a reminder of the consequences of hidden desires and fractured trust. Madison's name was rarely mentioned, her fate a silent lesson on the dangers of obsession and unrequited love. In time, Tifton healed, as small towns do, but the memory of Willie's life and the tragedy that ended it would forever linger in the quiet moments, in the shadows cast by the morning sun, a reminder of how swiftly life could unravel. And as life went on, those who had known Willie, Lynn, and Madison held close the memory of a story that had forever altered the fabric of their community, a reminder of the power of choices, of love, and of forgiveness in a world where nothing is ever truly simple.